Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Baer, Dean of the University of Washington College of Forest Resources. And on behalf of the entire college, I wish to welcome all of you to this three-part lecture series entitled Sustaining Our Northwest World, Tales from the Forest. Our intent in this series is to highlight the dynamic balance required to meet the growing natural resource needs of society while sustaining the environmental, economic, and cultural values we associate with our region's urban and wildland resources. This lecture series is a companion to the college's Denman Forestry Issues series, also seen here on UWTV, and both series contribute to the college's vision of world-class leadership in sustaining natural resources and environmental services throughout the region and beyond in order to improve the lives of future generations while satisfying the needs of people today. Using objective science to address our complex and contentious natural resource issues is a necessary, but by no means a sufficient condition for finding balanced solutions. We must also properly recognize and incorporate economic, social, and cultural values into the policy formation and decision-making processes. In essence, all three values, environmental, economic, and social-cultural, must be considered to achieve a balanced, sustainable solution that ensures the proper stewardship of our natural resources. We are pleased to present this lecture series in partnership with the University of Washington Alumni Association. We are also grateful for the support of the Rachel A. Woods Endowment, which is underwriting a portion of this series, and to members of the college's Dean's Club for their financial support. I encourage each of you to contact the college at www.cfr.washington.edu to explore the broad nature of natural resource issues that we are studying and to learn how our college plans to educate the next generation of natural resource scientists and leaders while creating and leveraging new technology to sustain our Northwest world. Today, we are fortunate to have University of Washington College of Forest Resources Professor Thomas Hinckley, an expert in tree physiology, with us. Professor Hinckley will discuss how he has fashioned a 35-year career as a teacher and researcher to inspire the next generation of natural resource managers, scientists, and leaders. His ability to draw connections between those who inspired him to enter the professorial ranks and the experiences he has enjoyed make for an enjoyable and an educational talk. The impact of changes in technology and experimental methods for conducting field research in both forest ecology and tree physiology are traced by Professor Hinckley as he recounts several of the research endeavors in different parts of the world. To start this adventure, I am pleased to introduce Professor Thomas Hinckley, who will speak on the topic Climbing, Research, and Teaching, 35 years of accidents, adventures, change, and joy.
I'm honored to be here, and I want to especially thank you for coming out on a very cold and dreary evening. Let's the adventure begin. This is going to be a personal exploration of what I regard as three really important facets in any academician's life. And I appreciate that not everyone in the audience is either an academician or aspiring to be one, but I think you will find some commonality when you look at these particular elements. And they're connected. There's the element of teaching, research, and learning, and they don't occur independently. They're co-occurring, and what I would like to illustrate tonight is sort of my development, my evolution. And for those of you who want to hear about accidents in mountains, I promise they will be here. One of the quotes that I want to take from Linda Brubaker is sort of the value of instruction or teaching, and that is the aha moments that occur. And that aha moment may be on the instructor's part when he or she realizes they've really messed up, or on the student's part when they finally get some idea or principle or concept that you're trying to provide to them. There's a parallel in research, and that parallel in research is not sort of the arbitrary collection of numbers or data, but the seeking of patterns within the data, the effort to understand how things work, how things are connected. I have to acknowledge students, colleagues, postdocs, friends who in a way have provided me both the learning and the opportunity to provide you the kind of information that you're going to hear tonight. I also have to acknowledge my family who, as the 3 yellow circles indicate, have been directly embedded in the research, helping me collect data in many different parts of the world, and in some cases actually learning about how to collect data at a very early age. So my goal this evening is to examine sort of what fosters the discovery of patterns and what leads to these aha moments, and try to pull that together. I will also talk about what changes and what does not, and this really only comes in hindsight. Here we sit. We all have sort of a collection of aspirations and goals, and as we think about those things, some of those things are going to unfold, and some of those things aren't going to unfold. And it's really the vantage point of a degree of hindsightness that you can look back at these kinds of things. And then I'm going to look at sort of the role that accidents, and I'm going to look at accidents in both a positive and, as you will also later see, a negative way. The role that mountains play, and finally the role that time plays. And we'll come back to time at the very end. So, my personal philosophy: enjoy, learn, accept disorder, notice where the dog is, and reflect. And it's the reflection part that is really critical, and this is where, from my own personal perspective, this is the role that mountains play in everything, the opportunity to reflect. The approach that I'm going to use tonight is going to follow mostly a chronological order. We'll start not in the total beginning, but somewhat in the beginnings, and look at how all of this unfolds. Periodically, we'll drop back and try to gather some of what are the common unifying elements, and we'll see where we go from there. So Bob Guerra talked about when he was 9 years old in a camp in Chile, looking at the plywood on the wall and talking about the pattern that some insect left on that plywood, and felt that at that moment he became who he is now, a famous forest entomologist. So why did I become a forest physiologist or a tree ecophysiologist? I think there are a number of things that I can sort of look back on to do that. One, I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania in a very rural farm-like environment. I had a mother who, when she finished college, wanted to go to grad school and wanted to go to grad school in forestry, applied to two schools, Yale and Duke. They both told her women do not go into forestry. And that conversation occurred probably when I was 9 years old or so. And I don't think until maybe the last half decade or so that I've actually reflected back and thought of perhaps the really strong impact that conversation had on the kind of decision that I later made. Mountains, starting at an early age, my grandfather took my mother and myself to the Canadian Rockies when I was 11, and it was there that I watched two individuals, though I don't think I really enjoyed the mountains. They were hard, there were bugs, there were scary animals, but I watched my mother and my grandfather enjoy them, and I think that was sort of an important lesson that I then grew along. Spent 2 long summers in Japan, had a great number of high school and college and university teachers and professors that left really important impressions on me. And finally, the final, it's not a joke, Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Lab was sort of the turning point where I became really interested in research. Japan provided me sort of the insight into a different culture, different world. It also provided me, for the first time, I'd been with my mother and grandfather in the mountains, but I was with peer group, same age individuals, a group of high school and college students. We went on several mountain trips in Japan, and it was there that I saw their appreciation and joy that they got out of being outdoors. My mother suggested that I go to the Colorado Outward Bound School, so you can already see the conversation and now Severo thinks the really strong imprint that she left. And I was probably in the second or third class that the Colorado Outward Bound School held when it was first formed. And there I learned the difference between a gentle teacher, this is Paul Petzold, who taught part of the climbing activities that occurred there, and a very non-gentle teacher who used, let's say, more swear words than articles when he talked. And let's just say I remember Petzold's technique being more effective. It was also the place where I began to be curious about the larger landscape, and particularly the function that that landscape had on where trees are found. And I think anyone that's ever been hiking or driving in the mountains, you appreciate that the sort of upper transition zone between where trees are and where trees aren't is not always a straight line. It's a really interesting line. And I began to wonder what led to that line being where trees were and why they were there and what they were doing. So this was an important beginning. For 2 summers in the Sierra Nevadas, either by myself or with friends, I climbed every peak between Mount Whitney and Matterhorn Peak. But I also had a chance to go to the White Mountains and see the bristlecone pines. And I also, as part of my job, worked with the Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Lab run by the Fish and Wildlife Service. There I did the first piece of research that actually was published. And so this, in a sense, began my interest in doing research in biology, and I will say to Bob Guerra, it was actually on insects. I ended up fascinated with trees, and I think, though most people think trees have some majesty to them and when in a group like in an old growth stand, really wonderment, but trees are really incredible organisms. They're incredibly diverse in terms of age, from young seedlings to almost 5,000-year-old plants, in size from this crumholtz near the ground to giant redwoods and Douglas fir and eucalyptus trees, and the range of environments that they occur in, almost from pole to pole, and clearly over a wide range of elevation. In the Andes, they reach 5,100 meters. Another part of my sort of background that I think is really important to understand when trying to grasp what being an academician is all about is a thing called the academic tree. It's somewhat like the family tree, and it has many good and bad elements like a family tree does to it. Harold Lutz was a professor at Yale University, and in 1950 he turned out 4 PhD students, one of whom was David Scott. And David Scott was my advisor. And Lutz turned out 3 other individuals, 2 of whom I know their careers. One was David Smith, probably the best known silviculturist at least in North America, and the other was Stephen Spur, who became the president of the University of Texas. So in an academician's life, that's a pretty good batting record to turn out people of that kind of caliber. Well, Dave Scott produced in the academic lineage me in 1971, Jim Lasoy in 1975, and I'm picking just a few of the students that he picked. Now, one of the negatives of the academic tree is we do a bit of inbreeding. Hinckley had a master's student named Peter Reich when he was at Missouri, and Peter went to Cornell and worked with Jim Lasoy on his PhD, which he received in 1985. Peter graduated. One of his graduate students is David Ellsworth, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan right now. And I'm only assuming David's producing a student. So you can see in really a short period of time, about 66 or 56 years, how many different sort of levels of in this academic tree there are. I also did a numeric calculation. I don't know Lutz's background, so I couldn't total up his master's and PhD students, but I do know Scott's, I do know mine, I do know Loisoy's, and I know Reich's, and I know Ellsworth's. 240 individuals coming out with master's degrees or PhDs from these individuals, and you can imagine then the ones that came out from the ones I didn't mention. This is both scary and good, and I'll let you can only imagine the scary part of it. Scott's lab was kind of, within the University of Washington, was kind of a unique lab. He has really sort of three foci in this particular lab. Silviculture, which is sort of the applied science of how trees grow in stands. Physiology. Importantly, he teamed with Richard Walker in the Department of Botany at that time. And that sort of collaborative team was really important in the training that we all received as grad students, not to mention the fact that many of us tried to learn German and a few actually succeeded. What he did is he surrounded us with lab mates. We were in labs at any one time in Scott's career that had between 8 and 13 students in it. That's a large lab. Dave Scott has a very hands-off experience. In fact, when I started my first job at Missouri, I kept wondering when it was going to get tough because I'd already been exposed to being alone in a situation. And then Dave's other thing is he turned us loose on the rest of the University of Washington campus. And as you already well know, this is an extraordinarily rich campus for the diversity of different faculty and students that there are here, and we learn from that group. Scott emphasized that we ought to master concepts and techniques. He subjected us to a thing called the Duff-and-Nolan stem and branch analysis. We either had to learn it as a student or we had to teach it as a TA. And let me tell you, after about 5 times, I still don't think I know how to do it. He emphasized field experiences. That is, that learning occurred by actually being in the field, by doing things in the field, looking in the field. He emphasized the role and the importance of immersion and that our peer group was critical. In other words, I still rely on people that I was grad student with to help me make decisions, to help me review papers, to think about various concepts. So now we're going to sort of go a little bit more into this chronology. We're going to look at some patterns and lessons. So we're going to look at some of the common elements we talk about Missouri as a foundation, sabbatical in Vienna, some research experience in Turkey, and then my University of Washington, which is the most extensive experience. I've divided into research, teaching, and administration, and then we'll talk a little bit about the future. All right, so what kind of changes in technology are there? And what I'm going to do is illustrate, on your left side is a gas exchange system that is vintage 1968, 1969. There's a cuvette. It's a plastic box in which you enclose foliage and you measure the rate of gas exchange, CO2 evolution, CO2 uptake, water evolution, water uptake. Now, before miniaturization, this is the control system for that cuvette. This is where CO2 was analyzed and measured. And this is where it was recorded on a strip chart recorder where you had to read every bit of time and every data point. If we go to 2004 or 2006, we can go to this on the lower right to a piece of equipment produced by Lycor in Lincoln, Nebraska. It does all the same things that were shown in the other picture, and the scale is exactly the same. And in fact, up above on the right, you see one of Tim Martin's students actually using this technique in the field. And I want to use this as an illustration of an accident. This large piece of equipment was left here because the International Botanical Congress was held in Seattle, and the person who brought it from Germany to display it knew Professor Walker, and as a consequence left the equipment here. I got to use that equipment. So as an example of continuity, I started with this basic interest in gas exchange, 1970. One of my PhD students, Phil Doherty, used it in Missouri in 1976. Bob Teskey used it in the field in Georgia in 1994, and then here in 2006, one of the grad students currently working in the lab is using this piece of equipment. His name will go on that picture when he graduates. Another example of continuity, and the diagonal arrow illustrates this, was my interest in measuring how much and how fast water moves up the stem of a tree. And on the lower left is a fairly old technique for doing it that actually came out of the mid-20s in Germany. And in the middle, under the 1992 hybrid cottonwood, is the sort of current technology that actually comes from the Czech Republic. Now, this illustrates an example of borrowing and using technology that comes from other places. It also illustrates the important role of collaboration. That instead of just bringing the equipment from the Czech Republic, we brought the people who actually designed this equipment and had them work with us for 3 years. And here they are in the picture 3, working in a young Pacific silver fir stand, and then 2 years later working high up in an old-growth Douglas fir stand at the Wind River Canopy Crane. But this is a bit of continuity. I would never predicted that my early use of this technique would have continued. Another technique that I've sort of been stuck with is the use of different methods to get up in the canopy of trees. And most of these have been cheap, been sort of centered around triangular TV towers. We see 1966 Douglas fir, 1968 Gary Ritchie's in the noble fir, white oak in Missouri in 72, old growth 140-foot towers, all carried up the trail, all installed by a group of us, including several grad students, and reaching a height of 145 feet. And then finally the Wind River Canopy Crane, and we have a platform that extends here between 2 trees. As I was reviewing this talk, my wife discovered for the first time in 1967, I had one of my first accidents. And I was working with Gary Ritchie, taking down one of these towers. I was at the top. I was a new graduate student. Gary was one of the old hands. And in my enthusiasm to show him how quick and good I was, I loosened the 2 cables on this triangle, and suddenly the tower had only one place to go, and that was to follow the other cable to the ground. And here I was at 80 feet, and fortunately, Douglas fir stands are dense, and I was able to grab a crown as I went by with the tower. Now, I don't want to belittle the almost 9 years I spent in Columbia, Missouri, but Missouri, because it laid from both a research and a teaching standpoint a critical foundation. And I'll apologize to anybody who really has their heart in Missouri. Missouri has terrible summers. I mean, absolutely dreadful summers. So my wife and I used every excuse we had to spend 30 days, the allotted vacation time, away from Missouri. And these pictures reflect some of those places that we found over that period of time. One of the things that we did, and I think this came from sort of the instigation that Dick Walker had in my training, was to spend a sabbatical year in Austria. And in fact, we spent 2, 78, 79, 88, 89. And there was principally interested in how to do the water relations of shrub species, and to learn a specific technique that had been developed by Hanno Richter, who's illustrated in the upper right corner. The work I did was in 2 locations. It was in the garden of this Botanisches Institute, and also on the side of the hill of Leopoldsburg. And Leopoldsburg is sort of right next to the Danube, and it's the last of the Wienerwald. As coming to the east of that is the Hungarian plain, and we studied shrub species there. And that was an important piece of work and an important learning that I was actually able to bring back to both Missouri and Washington, and there's sort of a legacy of students have learned this technique. I also spent time in Turkey, and as pictures 1, 2, and 3 illustrate, we spent 3 one-month periods there, and we had to use sort of different techniques. We didn't bring our towers with us, so we drove the microbus under the tree and used it for the canopy access. Long days, of doing work in the field, as picture 2 illustrates, created some unusual postures. 3, there were also associated long nights. Here we are working late at night. And one of the reasons for doing that is the power went out in the afternoon in Turkey, and you found that in the late evening, full power would come back on again, and then you could do all sorts of lab work at that time. We also had some interesting connections with the local populace. Because we spent so much time in the field, we had the people who heard it, who collected, who lived in the area, soon discovered us, and we discovered we had a commodity that they wanted, and they had a commodity that we wanted. And sort of many mornings, we made breakfast for each other. We made the coffee, which they didn't have, and they brought eggs, and we made scrambled eggs. So we got to actually interact with the people and see, to see how they lived, and they got to see what kind of equipment we had. The guy that was under number 4, when we left, finally ended up with a University of Missouri yellow hat on. This was another accident. We were there the night before May 1st, and May 1st, as you know, in most places outside of the United States, it can be a period of great unrest, and particularly in a country, this was in Turkey in 1979, the police stopped in. Let's say the Army stopped in and paid us a 3 a.m. visit to our tent, and we were, instead of any word coming in, suddenly our tent was brightly lit, and a machine pistol opened the door to our tent, and the voice boomed out of the night, "What are you doing here?" in Turkish. We were fortunate to have a note that said we could be there. We finished off a half a bottle of schnapps afterwards. So I came back to Missouri, or to the University of Washington in 1980, and I had climbed Mount St. Helens before it erupted, and so in picture 1 you see Mount St. Helens prior to eruption, and then we really have another accident. Here I show up, brand new at this job, not sure what I'm going to do, and my first research project is thrown at me, and that is the effect of the eruption of Mount St. Helens on the forest trees that surround Mount St. Helens. And you can see in pictures in 3 and 4 what these trees look like when coated with ash. And here we have sort of a closer view of those pictures. Picture 1 is a stand at about 4,000 feet. Picture 2 is a branch of a noble fir tree showing the older foliage mostly dead, and the small green buds of foliage coming out in early July in 1980. And in picture 3, you can see the level of the new ash surface. There's the old, where it was on May 17th, 1980, before the eruption, and you can see also a buried branch. And we were interested in what impact that this ash had on these particular trees. So that was the first study research project. We looked also at the recovery of these trees, too. And it was a team from the University of Washington, from Japan, and Jerry Franklin, who at the time was with the U.S. Forest Service, was responsible for a lot of the work that we did. Here we're looking at that same noble fir tree, or another branch on it, in 1981. It's a small tree. It's a sapling-sized tree, about 22 feet tall. And what we're going to look at is the foliage. Every year, an evergreen tree produces a certain percentage of its total foliage. For noble fir and Pacific silver fir of this size class, about 10% of the foliage gets replaced every year. For calibration, a deciduous tree like an alder or a cottonwood produces 100% of its foliage every year. An evergreen tree, a lesser percentage of that. So this is what it did the year before the eruption. This is what it did the year of the eruption. So there was a decrease the year of the eruption. And this is what it did the year after the eruption. It was a total surprise to us how much this tree actually compensated for the loss of foliage from the previous year. And I would also offer this was an accident that fortunately never got published. Accompanied Jeff Renner, when he used to be the science editor instead of the weather person for Channel 5, to St. Helens, and made this pronouncement that all the foliage, all the trees around St. Helens were going to recover based on our limited experience with the saplings. There was other evidence of recovery, and I'll show you how wrong I was. Here's fireweed coming up in 1980. These, in the picture from 1982, are mountain hemlock and Pacific silver fir trees that were covered in snow, so they were protected from the blast cloud. And in the picture in 1996, you can see how much they've grown. So we noticed that old growth Pacific silver fir, in contrast to the sapling trees, were beginning to die. And they began to die in about 1986. So we asked why. The graph in the center to the bottom we've already looked at for the sapling. So the year before the eruption, the year of the eruption, and the year after the eruption. Let's look at the same foliage production in the old tree. And the first impression is that the old tree produces very little new foliage every year. And that's because an old Pacific silver fir tree carries a tremendous number of years of foliage, about 23 years of foliage on it. So every year it only has to replace a small fraction of that. Well, when the whole is impacted and you're only replacing a small fraction, then recovery takes a long time. Well, this work and the work that Gerardo Segura, the student, did on this was really instrumental in how we thought about the recovery of a tree, how we thought about how the crown, individual branches of a tree responded, and led us to a whole new realm of sort of studying what occurs within the crowns of trees. Pacific silver fir was our tree of interest, and we spent from 1980, same time with the eruption of St. Helens, all the way until 2001, looking at what I would call the physiological ecology of Pacific silver fir, looking at young trees and old trees. An incredible collaboration. Lots of faculty, students involved, but the most interesting part of the collaboration, in my view, is there were scientists from 7 different countries that became involved in this project over its life. Cedar River Watershed provided us access to these particular stands, and it enabled us to do this kind of work. We learned from this, we learned from each other, we learned from the collaboration, and it provided the foundation for, obviously, additional work, such as work in hybrid cottonwood. When I first came to the University of Washington, there was already a collaborative program looking at hybrid cottonwood and the native black cottonwood. Ronnie Stetler, a geneticist in the college, and Paul Heilman, a soil scientist at Washington State University, who were partners in a long-term study of black cottonwood. They asked me and some of my graduate students if I'd be interested in sort of working with them. And there started what I regarded as one of the best examples of collaborative work that I've ever been either knowledgeable of or involved in. And this project, the last funding of the last student graduated in 2001 at this particular time. I have a student right now that's actually starting up work again in hybrid cottonwood. The pictures illustrate again the nature of the collaboration. In picture 3, we have individuals from Hawaii, from Belgium, and from the Czech Republic all working together. Now, the whole question was, even though in my view this was an ideal piece of science and an ideal collaboration, there was an interesting outcome as a result of our work in this particular. We'll come back to this outcome. One of the other things that you get to do as a faculty member is because of your connection with students, the connection sort of with this family of students that you encounter and work with, you get invited to go to places. And I want to illustrate the value of such an invitation. That is spending, in this case it was probably less than 2 weeks or 3 weeks in the Andes of Venezuela. First, you're exposed to a completely different system, climate-wise, culturally, and biologically. And as such, it's when you're sort of thrown these huge differences that you really, the concepts, the ideas that you have about how things work are sort of thrown against a wall, and you're forced then to rethink them. And this is a wonderful system to do it as tropical alpine systems. And you notice our work is at 4,420 meters, which I think is about 22 meters higher than the top of Mount Rainier. What makes this thing so unique compared to a temperate environment? Well, every night the temperature can go below 0, and some nights it can go several degrees below zero. So that means every night this plant's exposed to freezing temperature. And in temperate zones, we're used to a dormant season and a growth season. Well, here in a tropical environment, growth occurs during the day and dormancy occurs at night. So it's a very different kind of system. And the growth occurs in these particular plants in both primary tissue, that is leaves and buds, but also secondary tissues like trees have, the xylem. So here's one of those plants. We've done a manipulation with it. And what this plant needs to do in order to survive, it has to protect the sites of growth. So the first site of growth is the bud, and the bud is where the leaves are produced. And every night, as night comes, these leaves fold back up over the bud and provide a reflective surface that keep the bud just above freezing, even though outside the leaves it might be -4, -3 degrees centigrade. Notice the dead leaves on the stem of this plant. Those dead leaves insulate the plant. And interestingly, if you remove those dead leaves, you actually can get water to move up the stem faster. So the plant during the day, from a water transport standpoint, would be better off without the dead leaves, except as soon as night occurs, those protective tissues get killed as a result. So this is a nice illustration of a trade-off. So what unfolded from 9 years at Missouri and about 22 years of research, plus research at the University of Washington, I think there were sort of 5 conceptual areas that I felt that as a group of students, faculty, and colleagues that we really contributed to. The water relations of trees. And there's a rich list of people here that include former graduate students, folks in Italy, folks in Germany, and graduate students and former students spread all over the U.S. Branch autonomy. That is, how does a tree, remember, if you look at a tree, is sort of an aggregation of branches. And each branch has its own function, and it has parts to it. So do the rules that govern what a tree does also apply to a branch? And we worked on uncovering, yes, there are exceptions, and we uncovered what those were. Physiologists tend, whether you're an animal physiologist or a plant physiologist, you tend to look at cells, tissues, and plant parts or animal parts. But society really doesn't care if a leaf dies. Society cares if whole sets of trees in British Columbia die, or if trees in the Cedar River watershed die. So a major question comes up: how do you take your understanding of what leaves do or twigs do, how do you take that understanding and make it appropriate to the kinds of questions that society has? And that's scaling. In the production of the hybrid cottonwood trees, that if you compared the growth of those trees against either parent, a phenomenon called hybrid vigor or heterosis was noted. Not in every offspring, but in some, and enough to make it really both biologically and productively interesting. So understanding what this combination of an eastern cottonwood and a black cottonwood, how it produced this hybrid vigor, was one of the other things I feel really fortunate to have worked in. And the final area is the role that's water storage. If you think of a Douglas fir tree that's 250 feet tall, the foliage is at the top, the roots is at the bottom, that's a long distance. The tree starts losing water from the top. Where does it get its water? Part of it comes from transport in the xylem and uptake by the roots, but part of it comes from storage. The history of teaching will, I apologize, be much shorter because it obviously should occupy an equal time to research. I think my early teaching experience was to follow a traditional model. And what I mean by a traditional model, I had mentors, teachers, colleagues who I watched teach. They did good things, they did bad things. I tried to copy the good, and I tried to leave out the bad. Try is the important word here. I also got involved, but that's a very traditional way of teaching. You mimic, in a sense. I also was involved in professional education. That is, people that already had degrees were coming back to learn more. And This was through the Silviculture Institute, which later became the Natural Resources Institute. And this is a case where you have sort of field-hardened people coming in and challenging sort of a book-hungry person about how to translate their knowledge and how to convey their understanding to somebody that already really deeply knows about the system but may not have the right words or frame to understand that system. And there's a tremendous amount of learning that occurs as a result of that. The whole phenomenon of experiential learning, hands-on. What role does having a hands-on experience versus standing up like I'm doing now and lecturing you, which is sort of the worst thing one can do for retentive if you want somebody to learn or to retain something. So how do you give people hands-on experience? How do you use the field to do it? How do you use the classroom to do it? Working with youth through working with Gretchen Kolonji in material science and engineering. I got to work with 8th and 9th graders. Well, an 8th and 9th grader, you can't talk to them for more than about 2 minutes before you've already bored them to death. The term whatever becomes very prominent. So you have to create situations in which they learn. Well, you can actually transfer that learning to higher age groups, including yourself. I've been involved in an exchange program, undergraduate exchange program with Szechuan University, so now you learn sort of a culturally different way of learning and teaching. There's a National Science Foundation Integrative Graduate Education and Research Training Grant that I'm involved in. It's another way of learning and learning how to teach. And finally, the most latest thing is the use of this thing called the classroom presenter, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Most of the work I like to do best, it tries to have a field emphasis. I really think field experiences are a way of giving sort of a hands-on feeling for a concept or an idea. And it also helps students to develop, and instructors to develop, a power of observation and to really hone and mature those observational skills. The exchange with China has been very fruitful. We've brought probably some 45 students from the University of Washington have spent their junior year there, and an equal or a little bit more greater number from Szechuan University have spent their junior year here. The idea is during that year they conduct some research activity, and most of our research activity that I've been associated with is this small village in southwest Szechuan province. There's 4 faculty that are involved in this research. Until this date, there have been about 14 undergraduates, 7 or 8 of whom have received their senior thesis credit as a result of the research they've done here. A wonderful experience for both collaborative work, working in a different culture, and working in a sense in a very diverse system, in a system very different from what you're used to and what you've grown up with. So what's this classroom presenter? Well, this is a technique developed by Richard Anderson, a professor in computer science and engineering while he was on sabbatical with Microsoft. It's a little bit like PowerPoint that's highly interactive. And each student or each group of students has a tablet PC. So in picture 1, they've been given an instruction. And in that instruction, they've been told to draw a picture of Tom Hinckley. And I didn't give the instruction. In picture 2, you see one student's rendition of what their picture of Tom Hinckley looks like. In picture 3, the instructor, in this case, Jim Fridley, has chosen one of those pictures to display. So you can see what the students do on the tablet PC. They can convey that instantaneously in a wireless setting to the instructor. In picture 4, they're actually working on something more realistic than drawing pictures of Tom Hinckley. And the output from that is they were asked a particular question. They worked in a group of 4 to try and answer that question. They wrote their answers in short phrases down, and now that's up on the board, and that's being discussed in front of the class. They have ownership of that, but they also have anonymity from that. No one else knows who wrote that other than the group that wrote it. So it's a really highly interactive, this is what the tablet looks like. It's really a highly interactive technique to check in with students to see if what you're telling them, they're actually learning. You ask a question, if they give you the wrong answer, that's instant feedback that you're not doing the right thing. You can then decide how you're going to correct that. It's interactive, provides feedback, and it's autonomous. All right, so I'm going to put on my administrative hat shortly here. This was a quote that came out of the Seattle Weekly early or late in January. And it was followed the arrest by the FBI of a number of suspects that have been allegedly involved in a series of activities that have occurred over the West over the last 5 or 6 years. And whomever wrote this article in the Weekly was opposed to the use of the word terrorist, whether it was domestic or eco-terrorist, was opposed to that because he really felt like all they were doing was monkey wrenching, and at best they were sort of inconveniencing, saddening, and perhaps enraging a group. So here's the fire at the Center for Urban Horticulture on May 21st, 2001. Another view. And I guess my view is that it was an act of terrorism because it was a political statement. People hid. They didn't actually, like a protest movement, make themselves known who they were other than by an anonymous communique. And they did more than inconvenience. But out of this, sort of a remarkable sort of genesis occurred at the University of Washington. And it was, in a sense, a genesis that came about because of the will of both the staff, faculty, and students affected, but also the staff, faculty, and administrators who weren't affected, who were on the campus, and for people off the campus who weren't directly affected but felt some sort of kinship to this, and either through donations of everything from food to time to money, provided this sort of incredible jump start to rebuilding Merrill Hall. And so those of you who haven't seen the rebuilt Merrill Hall, I would invite you to do it. It's really a nifty new building that not only serves the original functions extraordinarily well, but it's built using a sustainable design. And one of the lessons that I sort of learned as an administrator from this, because I have mountains to reflect in, I tend to have a fairly optimistic, positive outlook, but not everyone has that. And the psychological impact has, for not only for me, but for others, lasted a surprisingly long time and been surprisingly significant. It goes beyond sort of being enraged. And for some, the terror, the actual sort of worry and concern about it reoccurring is real. Those are the negatives. The positive is this absolutely incredible support. And I don't know if I think when you see the tsunami and you see the earthquake in Pakistan and the Hurricane Katrina and the kinds of support that come from the public in those circumstances, you really begin to understand the capacity that humans have for supporting people. All right, so some of you have been sitting very long and diligently to hear about some adventures or about some accidents. So they're coming, I promised you that. So, beautiful day in September 2003, top of Mount Maud between Glacier Peak and Lake Chelan, watching the Maple Creek fire burn. Helicopter appears. Helicopter comes overhead. Fortunately, it was a clear day, so we could see the helicopter. I could only imagine if it had been a cloudy day. This voice comes out of the helicopter, and it says, "You must leave the area immediately." Okay? And we could see, because we had driven in when this fire had just started. It was about 300 acres, and it was now close to 6,000 acres. We could appreciate why this person was telling us to leave. In picture 4, the helicopter leaves. Only momentarily. There must have been a conversation within the helicopter and a recognition that amongst the 4 standing on top of Mount Maud, there were 3 individuals that had an incredible amount of white and gray hair. It came back, and it said, "Would you like some help?" Now, can you imagine a bunch of white hair, gray hair, old guys up on top of a peak saying yes to something like that? No, we didn't. And you can see with the red arrow, that's where we had to end up, and it was not a straight line down to it, too. We got out, and then picture 7 shows the pictures that we took of the fire. All right, accidents. All right, we start with picture 1. Some of the accidents haven't occurred to me, though 2 I will illustrate have occurred to me. One was in late May of 1995 on Mount Rainier. A group of us, myself and my son and some of his high school and scout friends, skied up to Camp Muir. On the way down, one of those individuals decided to jump off a small cornice and in the process dislocated his shoulder, and you can see him wrapped up there in the middle picture below. And we waited for a rescue. So I got to take pictures of the sunset. I also learned how poor my MOFA training was at that time, too. Picture 2. Any of you who saw the Olympics realize the most important thing that you do in the Olympics, whether you win or lose, is you get your ski up to indicate the brand that you have. I have yet to have Fisher show up and offer me a penny for this effort. This is what comes from skiing in the dark in a whiteout does. It was not a tree. Picture 3 illustrates the most recent sort of accident, and that's where I went wandering off by myself, ended up above the little green sort of quote sign. That's the words that I uttered when I fell. And I fell because this talus that I was walking across, it was between a subalpine fir tree and a group of junipers, looked extraordinarily stable. In fact, I swore there was a trail across it. As soon as I stepped on it, the whole thing went. And I've never had my feet taken, I took judo when I was in Japan, I never had my feet taken out of me so quickly in my life. And the next thing you know is this incredible noise, these rocks are going downhill and you're going with them. Well, my wife told me I should not go hiking and climbing alone anymore. Last weekend I think I did. All right, so what about the future? There's sort of 2 things I want to quickly talk about the future. One is sort of an interest in research that I now have. It no longer involves towers. You can see, you can actually get down on your hands and knees and look at this. Is the interest in what occurs in alpine and subalpine environments, and what role is climate change going to have on these particular environments. And the graph that has the time 2005 on it is some data collected near Hurricane Ridge in late July 2005 on a day, about midday, on a day when it was about 72 degrees out, or about 21, 22 degrees centigrade. Now, the important thing to note here is there's only one temperature in this whole system that was cold, about 10 degrees or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was the soil in the middle of this subalpine clump. Things that were at about 68 degrees are all the green plants that are in the shade. So anything that was shaded on this day was about 20 degrees centigrade. And then anything that was in the sun was between 25 and 30 degrees centigrade in this day. But if it was green, because it was losing water, it could stay cool. But look at these things that are near 50 or above 50 degrees centigrade. This isn't quite a temperature where you cook eggs yet, but this, for biological systems, is an extraordinary range of temperature, going from nearly 12 degrees centigrade all the way up to about 55 or 56 degrees centigrade. Incredible diversity in just this one day of temperatures. Well, how do plants survive in this kind of environment? So that's one of the things that I and students that I have would like to work on in the near future. We're going to take a group of grad students. We're going to go to Western Sichuan province in China this May. So this is coming up in the future. We're going to spend 2.5 weeks working in a national park there, learning how to interact with both students from Sichuan University as well as the managers in the park. 2 sort of future things in teaching that I'm interested in. One is a facility, and this is sort of a diagram of a picture of a project that I got to work on where we designed a classroom for the old library forestry library that used to exist in the basement of Bloedel Hall, where we could develop a highly interactive classroom. And this was the vision that the architects that we work with had for how this classroom worked. And you notice, the instructor has a tablet PC in his hand, and the students working in small groups all have this. So that's one vision. The other vision is a stronger partnership, and in this case it's with the Native American tribes in the state, in particular with the Yakima Nation. Over the last decade or so, the college has graduated 9 students with either undergraduate or graduate degrees from the Yakima Nation, and they have reciprocated their training at the school by inviting us to come and spend time with them. And we bring undergraduate students to learn about how they manage their forests, how they steward, using sort of cultural as well as modern techniques, how they steward their forests and their land. And we would like to open this partnership even further so that we have scholarships where we can bring students from the nation to the University of Washington, where we also work with their high school students so they began to see a path, they began to see sort of a rationale for why they might want to go to the University of Washington and why they might want to have a career in natural resource management. The Yakima Nation probably has the largest reservation forest of any nation or any reservation in the country. They have a tremendous resource, and they really are embedded and deeply embedded in the management of that reservation. It's really an impressive thing what they're doing, and it's a wonderful model for our students to see how they're doing this. So those are the dreams I have for the future. Thank you very much.